Hello. I had a request to make a video showing how to make LCD handheld or Coleco style or VFD style games in GameMaker Studio, which is what I did for my handheld games. So I thought I'd do a two-part series showing how to make the two type of games that I've done. One is more in that traditional Coleco style handheld, which were VFD games, and the other is in the Game & Watch style game. So make sure to watch both videos so you can see how they're done. It's actually really easy. So you'll see everything I do, and hopefully you'll come out learning something. And to be honest, I'm a sort of a beginner with GameMaker Studio too, so you might be able to take this and make something better than I did. It'd be really awesome to see. Okay. What I want to start by showing is the kind of game we're kind of developing here is shown up on screen now. You can see this. The game on the left is an original Donkey Kong Jr. Donkey Kong made by Coleco, and on the right is my Fix-It Felix Jr. with my programmed game running inside of it. What makes these games unique? These were VFD. The V stands for vacuum. I think it's vacuum fluorescent display. They were light up, single segments kind of lit up. Very few colors. Pieces couldn't overlap with each other. And when you moved your joystick, your character just moved kind of one direction. It wasn't, full sprite technology. Well, how do you create that in a game making language like GameMaker Studio, which is object-based? They actually have the tools to sort of do that. So on the right, you can see my Fix-It Felix Jr. game. If I go ahead and minimize that, the way I did it is by starting out by knowing exactly what my game board was going to look like. So I'll zoom this in a little bit. What's the most important when designing this type of game is knowing where every single sprite, in quotes, kind of, in our case, what we're going to use as sprites, will go on the board. Because those original games, right, they only had so many segments that could light up. And objects would only appear in those exact places. So we want the same thing. So the first thing I did was designed my entire game board at the exact same size. So I personally made this in Adobe Illustrator, but you can make it in anything. And this gives you an exact idea of what your layout will have to be, and how big your images, your objects will have to be, your sprites and all that. And lets you draw it out and how far away they are from each other and whatnot. It also shows you what your fully lit board will look like once it's all done, which is what many of these games do. When you boot them up for the first time, they would be fully lit up. So, here, if I start this game here, you can see me moving around, kind of like that Coleco game would have, right? I jump from place to place, colors never overlap with each other. Just like on the game board next to it, you can see where it all lines up. And if I get to future levels, right, we'll eventually get some ducks that pop in here probably. But you can see exactly where the bricks line up. There we go. There's a duck flying across. So this is my Fix-It Felix game. This type of game and many of those Coleco games were grid-based, right? If you really look at them, it's sort of a grid. They might look different. The sprites might look different when they're in different spots, but ultimately it's a grid. And so I really keyed in on that and realized, aha, if my game is designed like a grid, I can just make my object jump from point to point an exact distance, and then it'll seem like it's different segments of a screen lighting up. So that's kind of the methodology I used. You can see, oops. A second game I designed, so this is a newer game I'm working on called Felix's Bricks Away. Here's another full game board. Again, it's more complicated than the past game you saw, but you can see how when it's fully lit up, a character will jump from place to place as you move them around. So that's what we're going to work on in this video. In video 2, I'll show you how I make more of a Game & Watch style game, specifically the panorama games, which is going to look something like this. This is designed to be a mimic of the game Helmet, the Game & Watch Helmet game. And in this case, the grid doesn't work quite right because you can see as the objects move along these paths, they rotate a little bit. They're not equidistant from each other, so that won't work for for that. So I'll use a different methodology for that type of game. But for this first game, we will stick with this grid-based. So before we start a game from scratch, I'm going to show you briefly how I did things for this game. This game I called Felix's Bricks Away, because the code's a little bit more optimized than in some of my earlier games. This is the fourth game I made. You can see I have a bunch of sprites and a bunch of objects. For the most part, sprites line up with individual objects. In this case, I have a sprite called Felix, the main sprites, and then an object that's called Felix main, and this is where I go into them. I'm doing everything in Game Maker language, the drag and drop design, so it's real easy. So there's a bunch of stuff to make Felix do a variety of things, create bricks and make walls and stuff, but the most important part is actually going to be movement, and you can see I have left, up, right, and down. So if I toss in open left, you can see in this case, for the most part, what's important, when he moves, when I press the left key, I'm going to jump exactly 120 pixels to the left, negative 120x, and don't move the Y at all. And set the sprite to make sure it's the right sprite. How does that come out in gameplay? You can see, let's say I was this Felix right here. When I press left, I'm going to jump exactly 120 pixels to the left. That's where this grid really works out. Everything's got to be equidistant from each other. So he's exactly 120 to the left of him. He's 120 left, 120 left, 120 left. There's some other code in here that makes it so this will only run if a variable I have called allow move is equal to 1. That's set up so that I can't accidentally move too fast. Or if he's just been hit, I change that variable to 0 so then he can't move out of the hit, kind of an invulnerability phase. So let's start this up real quick, and I'll show you how that works. So there's Felix. I'll get a couple of lines down. And as you can see, as I move left and right, it's sort of lining up perfectly. And it's tough to see on screen, but there's actually a slight fade behind Felix, if you really zoom in here, showing invisible Felix is behind him, so it kind of gives it that translucent effect, right? In this case, when I move up and down, that's a slightly different setting. So it goes up or down a specific amount in the Y dimension. Pull ourselves off here. Head back to the game screen. So if we look in Game Maker Studio, right, I showed up and down. When I press up, same exact stuff, right? Only move if allow move is on. Except in this case, when I press up, I want you to go up the Y dimension 171.8. So to make this work, I'm using the jump to point drag and drop tool. And I'm keeping everything relative. That way it remembers where he was and adjusts the position relatively. Traditionally, in an object-based game creation, you would have movement set a speed, right? I would press the left key and it would increase my speed by 10 with my direction to the left. I'm not using that at all. I never set the speed of my objects. Everything they moved is like a jump. That way they disappear from where they are and instantly appear somewhere else. Again, replicating that movement, the kind of movement they had on these LCD or these VFD displays. You would instantly move from here to there to here to there. You wouldn't easily translate from left to right. It would be instantaneous. It would light up, because it's lighting up segments. It's turning the light off in one area and turning the light on in another area. There's a bunch of other code, like when I draw, and for example, like I said, when you move right or left, it sets the sprite so that it's the right variable or the left variable. That's all kind of superfluous. That's sort of basic Game Maker stuff you'll learn as you get along, and I'll get into that more when we actually start a game from scratch. But the most important part is the movement, replicating that moving left, moving right, moving in that grid base. So let's do that from scratch. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to use drag and drop. And we're going to create a new game in here, a new project. We'll call this, make a folder called right? And we'll call our project new VFD game. Save. GameMaker loads up. We've got a completely clean menu. So the first thing we need to do is create some new sprites. So I'll create a sprite here. I'm going to put I always make my my anchor in the center. That way everything lines up. I keep it consistent for everything. And we'll go ahead and edit that. We'll just make it a nice big red block. Use the paint bucket tool a little quicker. Great. Oops. Didn't quite get all the red there. That's all right. Okay. Very basic object. We're going to make this sprite 0 move left and right. Like I said though, what's most important is having your entire game board designed from the start. So in this case, let's say I was making a game like this. I would already know exactly how big I need my game board to be. I would come into GameMaker Studio and I would make a room that same exact size. So right now I have room 0. How big is it? It's 1024 by 768. Well, these Coleco games were oftentimes vertical, so let's make it sort of a vertical display. So let's say we're doing 480 wide by 800 high. It's a much more vertical oriented room, right? So when I'm doing my design in Photoshop or whatever, my initial layout, I would set Illustrator, Photoshop, Paint to be exactly 480 wide by 800 high. And then I would draw my pixels, my sprites on there to be the same exact size. So I know how big, when I come into GameMaker Studio, how big to make them. So in this case, we have a sprite that is 64 by 64. That's pretty big, but it doesn't really matter here. We'll go into our room. We have our instances layer, our background layer. We need to make that sprite into an object. So let's create a new object. We'll call it object 0 to match sprite 0, and we want it to use this sprite. And we'll have it be solid, and we'll say use the same collision mask as the sprite itself, which right now is set to be automatic. Perfect. Great. Okay. Add event. When it's created, nothing really happens, right? When it draws, we're not going to add any creation code. When it draws, we want to make sure to have it draw itself. That's very important. If you have a draw event and you aren't drawing yourself, your sprite won't show up. Now let's add some movement. So if I press the left key, or if I press the right key, we want something to happen, okay? Let's go back to our room. Now let's toss our object in there. And I'm going to keep things real simple on this grid, right? Let's say our starting position is right here. Boom, that's where he's going to start. Now, he's right there, and I can tell his current position is 416 by 672. If I put it over there instead, it's 352 by 672, right? The Y position didn't change at all, just the X position did. And it changed by probably 64, because that's how big this guy is. If my math is right, that would make sense, right? 416, 352. Yeah, seems about right. So let's put that guy there. Now let's go back to our object and say when I move left, when I key press left, jump to point, always relative, negative 64, keep it relative, and Y, don't change that at all. Keep that, don't move that 0. When I move right, jump to point, again, relative, plus 64, Y 0. Oh, he's 32. Origin 32 by 32. How big is this guy? 64 by 64. That's what I thought. Okay, great. So let me confirm that real quick that I have my math right, because I want to keep everything on a grid for this demo. We got 416 and 352. If I take 416 minus 352, 64. Perfect. Exactly right. Save my project. We'll go ahead and do a quick run. built up. And now I press left, and he jumps from place to place. And it lines up perfectly. Look at that. Moving left and right freely, jumping, right? It's not sliding, it's not moving slowly, it's instantly jumping. To get the effect even more, I might want to, that real jumps, that space in between, I might want to go from here, so we're at 415, all the way, let's do like a full block over to 281. So if I'm at 416, sorry, and we're going to toss it over to 288. What was it again? 416. 416 minus 288, 128. Perfect. Double size, that makes sense, right? So I can go back to my object and say, okay, instead of moving left and right with 64, moving 128 minus 128. Build, we run it out. Now I do a much bigger jump, back and forth. So I did the determination of how much to jump based on that grid I had drawn, but the real way you would figure this out is by first drawing your game board like this, or like this, drawing your full game board with all your sprites, all your pictures, and then measuring the distance, right? So I drew this first, I put all this artwork in first, and then I made sure they were equal distance from each other and measured what that distance was. So in this case, this character, the center of this character is exactly 120 pixels from the center of that character. So that's what how I would determine how much it moves. That way it all lines up on the grid. But for this demo, it's pretty simple just to kind of run this object-based stuff. Then from there, once you have your movement planned out, you just draw everything around it. You do collision, right? So in the case of my Felix game, I set up collision so that when my little guy is set to collide with a window and I press Control, make that window disappear and increase the score by 100. If I jump 2 over, fix that window, yada yada yada, you insert some code that says when all windows are gone, move on to the next level. And those are some basic game maker things. I can show those if people want. I can go from scratch to create an entire game if it would be helpful, but this is how I created movement to give it that VFD style. So there you go. Stay tuned for video 2, where I'll be doing showing a game more like this, which does not work on a grid system, but still includes jumping and has many different sprite looks. So if you see this guy, you can see he's completely different here, from there. So he has a bunch of different views. These objects can interact and they move. So it's a little bit different. It's more like a Game & Watch style game. Okay.